Today on Orbital Dispatch, life inside the International Space Station and why it's about to end forever. We will break down what happened and why it matters. Right now, 10 people are living in space. They're traveling at 17,500 miles per hour, completing a full lap of the planet every 90 minutes. And most of us never think about them. Here's what makes this moment different. The station they're living in, the most complex structure humanity has ever assembled in orbit, is scheduled to be deliberately destroyed in 2030. And what replaces it will change the nature of human spaceflight permanently. Today we're going to cover three things. What life actually looks like up there right now, in 2026. What the science being done aboard the station means for people on the ground. And what happens when it all ends. Because the answer is stranger and more interesting than most people realize. Let's start at the beginning. The history of an unlikely partnership. The International Space Station didn't emerge from a single grand vision. It came out of a very specific political moment. The Cold War had just ended, and the United States and Russia, two countries that had spent decades competing to dominate space, decided to try something different. They'd build something together. The agreement that led to the ISS took shape across the 90s, drawing in the European Space Agency, JAXA, and the Canadian Space Agency. 16 nations in total would eventually contribute. At the time, the idea of American astronauts and Russian cosmonauts not just tolerating each other, but genuinely depending on each other for survival, wasn't a given. It was a deliberate, difficult choice. Construction in orbit began in November 1998 with the launch of the Russian Zarya module, a pressurized cargo block that would form the foundation of the station's structure. Over the following 13 years, more than 40 assembly flights delivered laboratories, living quarters, solar arrays, airlocks, and connecting nodes. Piece by piece, the station was bolted together in the vacuum of space by astronauts on spacewalks, robotic arms, and engineering teams spread across multiple continents. The station has been continuously crewed since the 2nd of November 2000. That's the day Expedition 1 arrived. Commander Bill Shepard, along with cosmonauts Yuri Gidzenko and Sergei Krikalev, who docked aboard a Soyuz spacecraft and became the first permanent residents. Every single day since then, human beings have been living and working in orbit. Through 5 US presidential administrations, economic crises, a global pandemic, and shifting geopolitical tensions, the station has remained crewed without interruption. It stretches the length of a football field. It weighs roughly 420,000 kilograms, orbits at around 400 kilometers above Earth's surface, and has hosted more than 270 individual people from some 20 countries. But here's what most coverage of the ISS gets wrong. It focuses on what the station is, rather than what happens inside it. And what happens inside it is remarkable, particularly right now. Daily life in orbit, 2026. There are currently 10 people living aboard the International Space Station. That's a high number by historical standards, reflecting an overlap between expedition crews during a handover period. The outside world rarely notices them, but they're having very full days. The crew works roughly 10-hour shifts. 2 of those hours, every day without exception, are dedicated to exercise. Not because astronauts particularly enjoy cycling and pulling resistance bands in a cramped module, but because they have to. In microgravity, the body begins to change almost immediately. Without the constant load-bearing work that gravity demands on Earth, muscles weaken and bones lose density. The exercise regimes are aggressive and carefully monitored, precisely because the consequences of skipping them are serious. Sleep happens in small personal pods, compartments roughly the size of a phone box, mounted to the wall or ceiling of a module. Each has just enough room for a sleeping bag, a laptop, and a small personal kit. There's no up or down in microgravity, so pods are orientated in all directions relative to each other. You choose your preferred sleeping position and strap yourself in. The station is never quiet either. Fans, air processors, and equipment run continuously, so earplugs and eye masks are standard. Food is largely rehydrated or thermostabilized, meaning you either add water to a dried meal or eat something heat-processed for long-term storage. The food program has improved considerably over the decades, and astronauts do have some choice, but it's nothing like eating at home. Fresh fruit and vegetables arrive occasionally with resupply missions, and those deliveries are reportedly something crews genuinely look forward to. There's something that doesn't get discussed often enough, and it becomes important later when we talk about what replaces the ISS. The physical challenges of spaceflight are well documented, but there's a quieter set of difficulties that are harder to quantify. Living in a sealed environment with the same small group of people, with limited privacy, with no ability to simply go outside, with communication windows that depend on the station's orbital position, those things accumulate. The psychological dimension of long-duration spaceflight is taken seriously by space agencies. We'll come back to why that matters when we reach the section on what comes next. First, though, the science. Because what's being done aboard the station right now is genuinely worth paying attention to. The research happening right now. The ISS is, at its core, a laboratory. Everything else, the engineering, the logistics, the exercise regimes, the carefully packed food pouches, exists to keep human beings alive long enough to do science in an environment that cannot be replicated on Earth. Microgravity changes things. It changes the way fluids move inside the body, the way cells grow, the way flames behave, the way metals solidify, the way bacteria evolve. Some of those changes are problems to be managed. Others are scientifically interesting in ways that translate directly into applications back on Earth. The current Expedition 74 crew is conducting research into stem cell production. Specifically, the aim is to demonstrate that blood stem cells, the kind used in treatments for certain leukemias and other blood disorders, can be manufactured in large quantities in the microgravity environment of the station. The thinking is that orbital conditions may allow cells to grow differently than they do in a terrestrial laboratory, potentially enabling production at a scale that's difficult to achieve on the ground. This is early stage work, but it's exactly the kind of research the ISS was built to enable. Alongside that, the crew is working on three-dimensional bioprinting, using biological materials to print structures that could eventually have medical applications. There's also ongoing research into how microgravity affects bacterial behavior, how cartilage grows under different gravitational conditions, and how metallic structures form and behave in the absence of Earth's gravity. One piece of equipment worth mentioning: the microgravity science glove box, installed in the Destiny module, the American laboratory. It recently passed 100,000 hours of operational use since its installation in 2002. That's a significant milestone, and it reflects the sheer volume of experimental work that's passed through that single piece of hardware over more than 2 decades. In total, more than 4,400 research publications have come out of ISS experiments. Those papers span physics, biology, medicine, materials science, and Earth observation, the work of researchers from dozens of countries, many of whom have never been within 1,000 miles of a launch pad. And yet all of this is coming to an end, not because the science is done, it isn't, but because the station is aging, and the decision has been made to retire it rather than extend it indefinitely. Here's the part most people don't fully understand yet. The end of the ISS isn't the end of human presence in low Earth orbit. It's a handover. And the entity doing the receiving is not what you might expect. The end of an era, and what comes next. NASA has confirmed the International Space Station will be decommissioned by the end of 2030. The plan isn't simply to abandon it. You can't leave a 420,000 kilogram structure in low Earth orbit and walk away. Left alone, it would eventually re-enter the atmosphere in an uncontrolled way, and given its size, that's not acceptable. Instead, NASA has selected SpaceX to develop a dedicated deorbit vehicle. The plan is a controlled re-entry, pushing the station into the atmosphere along a managed trajectory so it burns up safely over the South Pacific Ocean, in a remote stretch of water, sometimes called the spacecraft graveyard. It's already the final resting place of previous space stations and hundreds of other spacecraft. It's a significant engineering problem. Nothing of this size has ever been deliberately deorbited before. Safely bringing down something the length of a football field in a controlled manner, ensuring the debris that survives re-entry lands where you intend it to, is a genuinely difficult task. Planning for it is already well underway. But the open question that matters most is this: what fills the gap? NASA is hoping for a 2-year overlap. The aim is for commercial space station operations to begin by 2028, providing a window before the ISS retires in 2030. That overlap matters because it would mean continuous human presence in low Earth orbit is maintained, rather than a gap opening up between one station retiring and its replacement being ready. The companies being given the opportunity to build those replacements are not space agencies. They're private companies, operating under NASA contracts, but not as NASA projects. This is a deliberate policy choice. NASA intends to become a customer of commercial space stations, rather than an owner and operator of its own. Axiom. Space is planning a modular station built from 4 sections assembled in orbit, which would eventually operate independently. Before the ISS retires, Axiom is attaching its own modules directly to the existing station, essentially using the ISS as a construction platform for its successor. Starlab is a separate project, a joint venture between Voyager Space and Airbus, aiming for a single large station that would carry a crew of up to 4 and include a dedicated research facility. Other proposals exist in various stages of development, and not all of them will reach orbit. This is a competitive process, and the commercial space sector has a mixed record with timelines. The 2028 target for commercial station readiness is ambitious, and there are people within the industry who will tell you privately that the schedule is tight. Which brings us back to the psychological dimension I mentioned earlier. One of the things the ISS has done quietly over 25 years of continuous operation is accumulate a vast body of knowledge about how people actually live in space over long periods. Not how they survive, how they live, what affects mood and decision-making, how relationships develop between crew members and ground teams, how sleep deprivation compounds with isolation, how small irritations become significant ones over months in a sealed environment. That knowledge isn't held in any single document. It lives in procedures, design decisions, crew selection criteria, and the hard lessons of more than 270 individual human beings who've spent time in orbit. Any successor station, commercial or otherwise, inherits some of it. But the transfer isn't automatic. It requires deliberate effort. That's one of the things that makes the 2030 deadline feel genuinely significant. Not just as the end of a piece of hardware, but as the end of an institutional continuity that took decades to build. Main takeaway: the evidence is still evolving. Subscribe to Orbital Dispatch.